Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Wright Flyer. Today's flight is piloted by Randy Wright, who is joined by his first officer Jeremy Grapenton. We know you have a choice when it comes to your radio listening pleasure, and would like to thank you for choosing to fly with the Wright Flyer. Ground traffic control has moved us to the departure lane, so please be seated, fasten your seatbelts, and ensure that all tray tables are stowed in the upright and locked position. We will be taking off shortly, and once again, we'd like to thank you for choosing to fly the Wright Flyer. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the show as we soar above the friendly airwaves in comfort and style.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Wright Flyer. This is your captain speaking, and I want to take this opportunity to personally welcome you to the maiden flight of our state-of-the-art radio program. We know you have a choice when it comes to your radio listening pleasure, and would like to thank you for choosing to fly the Wright Flyer. What's more, we're confident that no other radio program or venue will fly you over the friendly airwaves in as much comfort and style, nor leave you with an indelible yet pure sense of enlightenment, quite like we can here at the Wright Flyer. So, now that you're aboard, please be seated, fasten your seatbelts, kick back, relax, and enjoy the show. We've taxied to the departure lane and are awaiting takeoff clearance from air traffic control. While they go through that mindless, bureaucratic red tape and regimentation, my first officer, Jeremy Grapenton, and I shall delve into the pre-flight checklist because there is a lot of news and information to get to before we may indulge you with your in-flight entertainment. Now, I'm sure you all have recognized that we chose our launch date as September 11th of this year. There's a reason behind that. Today marks the 14th anniversary of those awful and terrible terrorist attacks which shook this nation to its very core. Those of us who lived through that awful and fateful day remember exactly what it was we were doing and where we were when we first learned that America was under a deliberate and direct terrorist attack. We also recall the display of solidarity and unity shown by the American people in the immediate aftermath of those horrible attacks. Even though 14 years have passed since that day, it doesn't really feel like it in some ways. We here in America have frequently held a belief that we were somehow invulnerable to these sorts of attacks. Partially, this is because we are separated from a lot of the hot spots in the world by two vast oceans. Yet, the attacks we suffered on 9/11, much like the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Empire of Japan, represent poignant reminders that a determined enemy, dedicated to the destruction of our constitutional system of government and our way of life, are capable of striking us when we least expect it. It also reminds us that we must always remain vigilant to protect our fundamental God-given liberties, rights, and freedoms. Otherwise, the forces of despotism and tyranny will reign supreme. Jeremy, why don't you share with our listeners what it was you were doing and exactly where you were when you first learned that America had been attacked that day?
Well, I know exactly what I was doing, where I was. I was at work. I worked on a roofing crew. We were re-roofing a house, and it was about 30 minutes away from where I lived at the time. Mm-hmm. And I come down off the roof for a cigarette break, and I sat in my truck, turned the radio on, and all I could hear was, on the one particular station, was the United States is under attack. Mm-hmm. And they weren't quite sure, but I started flipping through other stations, and I'm thinking to myself, this is some kind of joke. So I flip it to the next station, same thing. Mm-hmm. Next station, same thing. So I went and told my boss. I said, you need to listen to this. Mm-hmm. Come down and listen to the radio. Mm-hmm. And I went through all the stations with him, and he told all of us, he says, pack up your tools, get everything packed up. He says, go home, be with your families. He says, we don't know how this is going to play out. I don't want you here stuck at work and something happened where, he says, I just wouldn't feel right. Mm-hmm. So we packed up our tools. I got my truck and I left. And again, I was about 30 minutes from my house.
Mm-hmm.
I must have made it there within 10 to 15 minutes. I don't recall how fast I was going.
Right.
I don't recall even seeing any other vehicles on the road. It was like I was in my own little world,
Mm-hmm.
thinking about this, things going through my head, thinking, what's going to happen? I need to contact some people when I get home,
Mm-hmm.
call my parents, my other family, correlate with them, see what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And when I showed up, I took the members of my household, gathered everybody together in the center of my house, because I thought that would have been the safest place. And I went and grabbed my rifle, and the only rifle I had at the time was my Marlin 22 bolt action.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember loading it up, hands shaking like they've never shook before, loading the ammunition into the magazines. And I didn't sleep for 3 days. It was just one of those things like, this can't be real. I can't believe this is happening. And then when I turned the TV on, I saw the second plane hit. Right then and there, I knew it was happening. So I started thinking, what am I going to do? I need to protect my family, members of my household. I'm not going to get any sleep. I refuse to sleep until I know it's safe for my family and myself.
For me, I remember quite clearly, we had just buried my grandmother the day before. In fact, most of my family were attempting to board a little puddle hopper here at the Waco Regional Airport to fly back home. At the time, I was suffering from the flu, and I remember waking up from a fever to witness the first tower collapsing on the news. It all seemed so surreal, like I was in a delirious dream state. I think we were all in shock. It was all so unexpected. Of course, I was only 16 years old at the time, so I wasn't very politically active, because most teenagers at that time weren't. But 9/11 was the event that finally pushed me to become politically active, and to pay attention to my surroundings. And it's something we have to be ever vigilant about, because, as I've said before, these nefarious enemies of our way of life, of liberty, and of justice, and of a true sense of equality, are fanatical in their devotion to the destruction of our way of life. And nothing will back them away other than a strong stance by the American people to stand up to them. And I'm sure you've noticed in these 14 years since that horrific and fateful day that we have lost the solidarity and unity that we showed for, a good solid 3 weeks after the attack? Maybe I'll be even more generous here and say that Americans shared solidarity and unity and saw a greater good for the country for a period of about 3 months. But I can recall that it had started to fall apart fairly quickly, much more quickly than it would have, say, during the time of World War II.
And that's the thing, and I think the complacency with the American people had a lot to do with that. Prior to the 9/11 attacks, the last attack on the United States that is memorable for a lot of people, and of course you and I weren't around then, was Pearl Harbor. And looking back through history, talking with my family members that were alive at that time, and so on through the generations, the stories and the information that was passed down, the factual events, the way it was told to me, it's almost like it was like I was there. And
Right.
there just isn't, from that point on until 9/11, the complacency started to set in. Before it came, it was like a taproot, just digging its way in to the American population. 9/11 happened. It's like that taproot was severed, and that leaching tree of complacency was cut down. But the taproot was never removed, and it started to grow and sprout again. And over the past 14 years, we've seen that complacency even more so, I think, than before 9/11. And a lot of that may have to do with, the nature of the attacks, the events, people believing, we toppled Saddam, bin Laden's dead. Everybody seems to be at ease now, and then now we have more things happening as a direct result of 9/11. It's the perpetuation of those terrorists, amongst other things. I mean, there's so many tentacles of that are reaching out and grabbing hold and squeezing the life out of our country, what our country is supposed to be.
And what else I also think that it is that this was part of a unified or concerted effort by the political powers that be to besmirch and attack the national character and identity of the United States. It's as if there has been a deliberate or orchestrated effort to divide and conquer the American people, thereby slowly tearing apart the tenets of the United States Constitution. And of course, as we've always seen, the political powers that be engage in these Orwellian word games. And of course that brings me to the first example of the political elites using the crisis of 9/11 to their advantage. And, this was almost immediately after 9/11. And that was with the passage of the so-called Patriot Act. That's such a deceptive title. I mean, who could be opposed to something which elicits patriotism? Yet when fully examining the law, it becomes quite clear that there's nothing patriotic about it. On the contrary, it is a deliberate attack against the fundamental liberties that every American enjoys. Those unalienable rights that government is not authorized nor ever should be authorized to take away, since those unalienable rights were endowed to us by our Creator, God Omnipotent. Only He has the authority to take those away from us. And it goes to another point that we have forgotten a bit in this country, that we operate under a natural law system. That is to say that all of our fundamental inalienable rights are endowed to us by the Creator, and that as we as the people hold sovereignty and delegate it to the states, who then delegate authority to the federal government via the United States Constitution, the political powers that be don't like that. They find it to be too limiting on their power. They want to amass more wealth and power for themselves and to carve out a separate code of conduct which applies only to them, while ruling over us with, for lack of a better term, an iron fist to live by these extra-constitutional edicts that have no place in a free society like the United States of America.
Well, and these are the truths that are self-evident that Thomas Jefferson spoke about in the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. They're endowed with unalienable rights by our Creator. Those are the truths, the very roots of the fundamental principles and foundational principles of what this country was established on. Those are the very things that scare beyond it's beyond recognition these despots and potentates that want to have nothing but supreme rule. And no matter who it is that's in office, there's always that saying, absolute power corrupts absolutely. When they want to hold on to that power, and they don't want to relinquish it, even by being voted out of office, presidential term limits are 4 years. You often see more, at least in our lifetimes, we've seen every president seek a second term. And in my lifetime, we've had Reagan, George Herbert Walker Bush, then Clinton, George W. Bush, and then Barack Obama. Of those 5 presidents, only one that was not reelected for a second term, and that was George Herbert Walker Bush.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't want to relinquish that power, and if you look at the Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate, there's an old joke, the first year senator or congressman, spends the first year in office trying to figure out how in the hell they got elected. And every year after that, they try and figure out how they're going to stay elected, because they don't want to. They want to keep eating from that pie or that trough of power.
Mm-hmm. And it goes down to the line that they have amassed certain powers of wealth that they didn't have. And of course, this leads to another problem that immediately arose after 9/11, and that was the unwillingness by the federal government to clearly identify who our enemy is. It was declared as a war on terror. But what is a war on terror? Isn't that like declaring war on a tactic? Imagine, if you will, defining World War II as the war on Blitzkrieg, or the war on the kamikaze attacks in the Pacific Theater. It just doesn't make sense. But the ugly truth about all of that is that the doctrine of political correctness was already beginning to suffocate our country. Political correctness being utilized in such a way as to deliberately attack the freedom of expression which is guaranteed by the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. Yet also, this is part of that overarching social Marxist doctrine which is also designed to whittle away at our fundamental freedoms safeguarded by the Bill of Rights.
Sure. And you bring up a very poignant issue there. Speaking, and I'll use the First Amendment as an example.
Okay.
Speaking in terms of political correctness, it's changed the mindset of individuals, and they've gotten away from what it is to be understood as exercising your rights. Individuals always say, I know my rights. I have the freedom of speech under the First Amendment. I can say whatever I want. What political correctness has done, it's warped the vine of truth and founding principles of what our unalienable rights are, and it's caused people to lose sight of the more important aspect of what your rights are, taking responsibility for your actions. Yes, everybody has the freedom to say whatever they want, but they have to be prepared to accept the consequences for those actions. And you and I have talked about this, and we've actually had phone conversations with my dad, and this has come up, and we use the example of yelling fire in a crowded movie theater. And people say, that's illegal, it's a crime to do that. No, it's not. It's not, because that's freedom of speech. It becomes a crime when the result of exercising your freedom of speech causes damage or injury to other individuals. Now, if you go into a crowded movie theater and you yell fire, nobody gets up out of their seats, nobody does anything, but maybe somebody laughs. Where's the crime that was been committed? There isn't one.
Right. And see, that's part of a misunderstanding that a lot of people have with the criminal justice system in the United States. In order to have a crime, you have to have actus reus and mens rea. An actus reus is a guilty act, mens rea is a guilty mind, and they have to coincide. But part of the problem with that also is that with some of these statutory crimes, the government has moved away from applying all of the elements. Say that they are looking more to say just having a guilty mind now is enough to try and convict you of a crime. Even though we haven't quite gotten to that extent yet, as a whole, we have noticed with the politically correct debate that they try and silence anyone that disagrees with what is accepted by the powers that be, whether it be the Southern Cross battle flag or speaking out against gay marriage. And, we'll get into more details with the gay marriage issue in another segment, but I want to go into what this also demonstrates. Tying this back to 9/11, it is this: whenever there is a tragedy or great upheaval within the United States, the first response by the federal government is to increase its own authority under the guise of protecting we the people. It's a continuation of a definite pattern that started at least as early as World War I. President Woodrow Wilson increased the size and scope of the federal government by leaps and bounds. This was further expanded upon by FDR in World War II, and we have to recall that that was on top of a monumental increase he had already made via the New Deal back in the 30s. Now, in the case of 9/11, it was the establishment of the Department of Homeland Security, as well as concentrating airport security in the hands of governmental agencies as opposed to private contractors.
Sure. And, when you talk about that, the American people need to understand something. When the government is so willing to expand their own powers, and they use an event like that to pass it off to the American people, their voters and constituents, when the American people say, sure, that sounds great, I'm going to reelect him, he's making our country safe. What's really happening is they're voting away their rights. They're voting away their liberties. For what? A sense of security?
A false sense of security.
A false sense of security. Benjamin Franklin said that those who are willing to trade their liberties for any form of security deserve neither.
Right.
And that's what's happening. And, this is such I don't want to use the term that I really want to use.
Malarkey.
Right. And what it is it's mass confusion. People understand, yes, I have rights, but they don't want to exercise them to the fullest extent or deal with the consequences for doing so. But at the same time, they're willing to give up those rights so that they can feel safe. American people, and especially our passengers and other listeners, I would certainly hope that they come to the understanding that it's not the government's responsibility to make you feel safe. It's not your local law enforcement's responsibility to make you feel safe. It's nobody's responsibility but yours.
Right.
You are the only person that has the right to be safe and to make yourself safe. That's what the Second Amendment is all about. That's what the Fourth Amendment, in fact, that's what all the Bill of Rights are in conjunction with each other, which carry the full weight and full effect of the United States Constitution as the supreme law of the land.
Right. And, to give kind of a concrete example of this, it reminds me of that story, what was it, about a week or two ago, that involved that 22-year-old Korean foreign exchange student who was sexually assaulted by the TSA employee in an airport restroom. Well, due to the doctrine of sovereign immunity, it makes it difficult to seek civil damages against governmental actors. And of course, that wouldn't be a problem if we still used private contractors for airport security.
Sure.
But what this simply demonstrates is how the concentration of governmental authority never really helps the people in the long term. Basically, what has been happening as a result of this concentration of governmental authority, particularly with respect to airport security, and I apologize to our passengers if they got roughed up by the TSA, but it is this, that the government is insinuating that we lose our rights whenever we go to board a plane. It all stems from this notion that the Constitution is a living document. That's totally incorrect. The Constitution is not a living document. Rather, the constitutional process is a living process.
Correct. And a lot of people don't understand how that works. They want to say, well, the Constitution, it's evolving, it's ever changing. It doesn't mean what it used to. Stop whining, because it always it means what it always has. It's very easy to read and comprehend and understand. A fifth grader can understand it. It's written to where a fifth grader can understand it. Now, if Groucho Marx was around, he'd tell you all, quick, find him a fifth grader, because they actually could understand it.
Right.
It was written in a language because the founding fathers collectively amongst them, and I hate using that term collectively, but
Oh,
as
I know.
a whole, they were wise beyond their years. You could take some of the greatest legal minds here in the United States, lump them all together, and then increase them exponentially by, like, I don't know, 10 to the 100th power.
Right.
And it wouldn't even hold a candle to what our founding fathers had established and what they had envisioned for this country.
Right, right. Well, folks, we're going to make a quick connecting flight here, so sit back and relax as we go ahead and get that underway. All right, folks, I'm now going to deviate the flight path a little bit here and talk about something that clearly demonstrates that the United States isn't approaching things in a unified vision any longer. As you all know, this past summer has been one of incredible strife. Whether it was the tragic and senseless slaughter of 9 innocent people at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, back in June, or the senseless slaughter of 2 innocent journalists merely attempting to do their job, or even the recent rash of police shootings we have witnessed in the past several months and weeks, tension is clearly building in the United States. The notion of identity politics is wreaking havoc throughout our country. It's an ugly scar on our national character and identity. Yet, once again, the doctrine of political correctness is slowly strangling the life out of this once robust nation. There is no denying that this doctrine has poisoned the country and plagues the national body of the United States like a cancer. You know, ABC News still has refused to release the 23-page manifesto of the killer of those reporters, Vester Flanagan, who was a former employee of the Roanoke, Virginia television station and broadcast under the pseudonym of Bryce Williams. Now, he had clearly stated that he was motivated by the tragic church shooting in South Carolina by that deranged moron, Dylan Storm Roof. The differences in how the media has handled the Dylan Roof case and the Vester Flanagan case is appalling. It's a naked display of their politically correct agenda. The media was basically frothing at the mouth to attribute Dylan's racism to all members of a particular geographical region of the United States. They latched on to the inanimate object of the Confederate battle flag, the Southern Cross. They refused to do so with respect to Flanagan, who claimed that he had been discriminated against because he was a black man and a homosexual. Even after authorities found a gay pride flag in his apartment, they refused to ask similar questions to those that they posed in the wake of Dylan's rampage. It's this sort of balkanization occurring within America that is a true danger for us all. What's more, the mainstream media is ignoring one of the fundamental cornerstones of our representative republic, namely, that the United States of America is a nation of laws and not of people. What I mean by that is that the laws are supposed to apply equally across the board, irrespective of who we are or what political views we hold. Journalism is a dying art. The mainstream media merely cares about its own agenda and apparently nothing else.
Well, I have a question for our passengers and listeners. Like you mentioned, the Confederate battle flag, the Southern Cross, that it seems that, you know, when that was found out, that there was a little picture of Dylan Ruth, you know, holding that. They focused on that. They seemed to push everything else aside. The facts of the tragedy that happened there in Charleston. They didn't want to focus on that. It would be too much for them to do that. Too daunting of a task. No, they had to go after a symbol of historical value that is, regardless of how it was used in past history, it still is historical. It has relevance as to what and how our nation was shaped and formed into. My question is, with all of this stuff going on, with the rulings on gay marriage, the Supreme Court screwing up yet again in their ruling. Why isn't there a push to ban the rainbow flag or the gay pride flag? It's a very simple question, and you know what? I think our passengers deserve an answer to that.
Oh, I do too. I do too. And you know, this all ties back to the type of changes that we have experienced here since the 9/11 attacks. The Constitution has come under a consistent and steady attack by both political parties. And ever since President Obama assumed the reins of power, we have seen an exponential increase in the assaults on liberty. Two major cases come to mind. First, Operation Fast and Furious, and second, the unabated spying by the National Security Agency against United States citizens without first procuring a warrant. These two cases are blatant attacks on our fundamental unalienable rights. It's shocking how technology can be a double-edged sword. It provides us with convenience which was previously unimaginable, while, on the other hand, it has provided the government with unforeseen power to encroach upon our liberties and our way of life. The federal government is more corrupt today than it ever has been in our entire illustrious history, and I think that this goes across the board for us all. When we look at the rate at which the government has been encroaching upon our daily lives, it is flabbergasting to see the extent to which that they have been able to do this, and the lack of response by the supposed opposition party. Why even have an opposition party if all they're going to do is rubber stamp the president's agenda?
Sure. Well, this kind of reminds me of dodgeball. Okay, you have one team that's supremely dominant. They hold all the cards. They're the ones who have all the balls on their side. And then you have the opposing team, GOP, that really have no understanding of how the game is to be played. They know how the game is played, but they don't have an understanding of what they need to do. Okay? So all these balls are being hurled at them, and instead of catching them, using them to block and fend off, or even returning fire, they stand there with their arms behind their back, their chins up high, as the elitists that they are, and they take it. They take the shots to the gut, they take the shots to the head, and they don't do anything in return to stop it. We saw it with Fast and Furious. There have been a couple of individuals who have since become silent, to my recollection. Daryl Isis, one. He was big on Fast and Furious. He was calling out Trey Gowdy, so on and so forth. Now all of a sudden, where are they? Why aren't they speaking out about this? Why aren't they saying anything? Why aren't they bringing it to the forefront? Mitt Romney lost the election because he did exactly what I told people he would do. He based his campaign on economics. Economics doesn't mean anything in the grand scheme of things when our country is being tattered at the seams. Economics will fix itself if the Constitution is upheld. He could have very easily won that election had he done one thing: brought Fast and Furious to the forefront.
Fast and Furious and both Benghazi. But you know, Jeremy, it reminds me of another type of constitutional infringement that we're witnessing unfurl here in the United States. As I'm sure you, along with our listeners, are aware, the backlash resulting from the Supreme Court's decision regarding gay marriage earlier this summer is now in full swing. Kim Davis, the Rowan County, Kentucky clerk, has been released from jail after being found in contempt of court for refusing to issue same-sex marriage certificates. Mrs. Davis has stated that her main problem with issuing marriage certificates to same-sex couples is that it violates her deeply held religious convictions. In other words, we're seeing a multifaceted constitutional crisis developing as a direct result of the Supreme Court's earlier decision. The question which arises out of this case is whether one gives up their fundamental rights by accepting an elected position. That, of course, ties it back to the earlier segment we had discussing the way in which the TSA treats airline passengers. What's more, this is the sort of question that should never have to be addressed in the first place. Unalienable rights, by their very nature, means that no one, except the Creator, could ever take those rights away. The government simply lacks the authority to do so, and when it attempts to do so, it is in direct violation of the United States Constitution as well as the tenets of federalism. What we need to do in this country is go back to the proper scope and application of the United States Constitution. It really is that simple. However, the political elites, as you have mentioned, who hold the reins of power in this country, fear losing their stranglehold on the power and wealth they have illicitly amassed for themselves. They completely disregard the proper definition of sovereignty within the United States, namely, that the sovereignty of the country rests in the hands of the people. Our entire government is established upon this fundamental principle, which is undeniable. The federal government is one of enumerated powers. In other words, they have to trace their legislative authority, or any authority for that matter, back to a particular power delegated to them by the states and the people via the Constitution of the United States. This is clearly demonstrated by the language of the 10th Amendment.
Absolutely, and a lot of people want to say, and I want to bring this up for the 10th Amendment for all of our passengers and listeners. There's this whole phrase that's been used for a long time, and it's actually a false understanding of what the 10th Amendment is. People seem to have this idea that states have rights. They always say it's a states' rights issue. What they don't understand is the 10th Amendment makes no mention of any rights whatsoever. They are delegated authorities. Those delegated authorities have to come from somewhere, and because the Constitution is ordained and established by we the people in the preamble, those delegated authorities are derivative and delegated by the people. The people, the citizens of the United States. Let me say that again. The citizens of the United States have all rights and authority to delegate those authorities to the state and then to the federal government, which holds less authorities than the state does. And there's a reason for that. And with this whole attack on the Constitution and this attack on traditional marriage, I've given this a lot of thought. This is the federal government's way. When I say the federal government, the Supreme Court comes to mind as the pawn that's been led out to be the first move initiated in a chess game. They're using this to disconnect the pathway of those delegation of authorities. It goes from the people to the state, and then from the people to the state to the government. What they're doing is they're putting things in place to usurp the authority of the states, i.e., issuing marriage licenses, which is indicative of marriage being a privilege, not a right. Therefore, the state has the right or the authority. I can't believe I just said that. The state has the authority, the power to grant or deny those marriage licenses. When the government and the Supreme Court has made the ruling and says, no, you can't do that because it's a perceived right, now they've taken that authority away from the state, which has essentially burned the bridge between the American people and the federal government. If the states lose their sovereignty and their delegated authorities from we the people, then it means the people and the government will go head to head. The state authorities are the balance. That's the pivot, the fulcrum, is what keeps this country balanced.
And essentially, its judicial review is actually operating outside the scope of the Constitution.
Absolutely.
By using what is known as the Substantive Due Process Clause, the United States judiciary has enacted rights which are not rights in the traditional sense of the word. The Ninth Amendment clearly states that the government cannot create rights, nor can they take rights away. It's staggering how few people actually understand this. And I don't mean this in a disparaging way. Rather, it's shocking, or a shocking statement, as to the condition of education within the United States.
Sure, and this speaks, again, I can correlate this, both you and I can, directly back to political correctness. Political correctness has allowed, it's really, political correctness is the beast, okay? And it has many, many tentacles out shooting from it. Some of those tentacles are revisionist history. You have, aside from that, this notion, again, that I mentioned, that people believe states have rights. All these different facets that are coming out and wrapping themselves around the core of our founding principles and the Constitution and squeezing the life out of it, suffocating it. It's built complacency. The more people become complacent and follow that mantra from the elitists, do as I say, not as I do, you eliminate free-thinking individuals. You eliminate the possibility of an individual to say, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. That doesn't seem right to me, but if the government says it's right, then it must be true. You know, it reminds me of these people that bought into the whole, montage of, hi, I'm from the government, we're here to help you.
It basically all comes down to a question of the proper scope of federalism. The United States Constitution is clear when it states that the state governments possess plenary power. This is because the power which is delegated to the federal government is limited by its very nature. Therefore, the question of federalism is one which has been paramount in most of the governmental disputes which have occurred throughout American history. I believe that the gay marriage issue is yet another example of the proper scope and application of the tenets of federalism being a primary issue behind the entire debate, which is getting at what you were saying earlier. Furthermore, I believe that Justice Clarence Thomas was correct in his dissenting opinion when he stated that the application of the 14th Amendment substantive due process clause was inappropriate in the decision rendered by the majority. In Obergefell v. Hodges, the Supreme Court held that the Fourth Amendment requires states to issue licenses for same-sex marriages and recognize marriages of two people of the same gender lawfully licensed in other states. In a sense, the Supreme Court has legislated from the bench, creating a definition for marriage which is contrary to a prior decision handed down by the court in which the Defense of Marriage Act was overturned. In United States v. Windsor, the Supreme Court struck down Section 3 of the Defense of Marriage Act, which had federally defined marriage as between one man and one woman. The majority opinion reasoned that this was a direct violation of the Fifth Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. Therefore, the federal government must recognize marriages licensed between same-sex couples by the governments of the several states. However, this argument also creates the question of whether a federal definition of marriage is in violation of the tenets of federalism as outlined in the United States Constitution. In this case, Mrs. Davis, I think, could bring a 10th Amendment claim. After all, in Bond v. United States, the Supreme Court held that an individual may bring a 10th Amendment case before the court just as a state could.
Absolutely, and I believe she could actually file a 1983 suit as well. And see, I recall what she said, and I watched the video. She was asked, under whose authority are you denying this marriage? And she says, under God's authority. I think what she was doing was subconsciously connecting that the United States Constitution, in every facet, shape, and form of it, pertaining to the state's delegated authorities, falls right under God's authority, because the Constitution is rooted in natural law. Natural law being derivative of our God, the Creator. So I think inadvertently, and I don't know if anybody else picked up on this, but I think she was actually speaking to that in no uncertain terms. And people actually looked at her as, she was crazy. like she was some kind of religious zealot that was saying, God's authority is over all. Well, God's authority was endowed to us with our unalienable rights and our rights as citizens to delegate authorities to the government to govern us. This country, and people don't seem to have forgotten this, again, due to revisionist history and ultimately political correctness, that we are governed, or those that govern us do so by our consent.
Right.
It is a government of governing individuals by the consent of the governed. That that speaks volumes as to exactly what our Constitution is based on, with being natural law.
Right. And since the Supreme Court stated that the federal government must accept same-sex marriages as defined by the several states, wouldn't it be a corollary that they must also accept state governments which refuse to recognize same-sex marriages? I mean, the very language of the court's holding in Windsor v. United States clearly demonstrates that it was accepted that the state governments were, via their general police power, the only governmental entities authorized to define marriage. Therefore, the aftermath of the Obergefell v. United States decision, resulting in Kim Davis being held in contempt of court, demonstrates an impermissible federal definition of marriage. The Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment cannot be used as a backdoor to judicial legislation.
Well, and here's the other thing. Essentially what the Supreme Court has done with that ruling is they've actually abridged and infringed upon the rights of every individual in every state. Because now they're forcing people to, or forcing the states, again, which get their authority from the people. States have the laws. In Kentucky, their constitution was amended. And the amendment to the Constitution, which becomes state law, stated that marriage was recognized as between a man and a woman. The individuals that voted for that, to allow that amendment to pass, their rights have been violated. Their voting rights have been violated. They've been completely crumpled up and just thrown out and said, basically, you voted for this. It doesn't matter. Your vote has been abridged. It does not exemplify what you intentionally voted for.
Right.
The same thing happened with
Proposition 9.
I think it was Prop 8 in California.
Yeah, Prop 8.
Prop 8 in California. 3 times. 3 times. Now, you and I have a mutual friend who, ladies and gentlemen, we will have, I promise you, he will be on one of our flights. More than likely as an air marshal controlling any havoc. Him and his significant other voted 3 times in California.
Right.
For the California amendment that said marriage is defined as a man and woman. That was thrown out by a judge who happened to be homosexual, by the way. Overturned all that. So 3 times their votes were overturned.
Yeah, I see this as the government overreaching its authority in a way which violates and is contrary to not only the prior decision handed down by the Supreme Court just 2 years ago, that being the Windsor case, but it also results in chaos. Already, a Tennessee district judge has denied a couple their divorce on the grounds that the Supreme Court has ruled that the states are incompetent to determine what marriage is. It has long been held that the state governments are the ones which handle family law issues. Whenever possible, the federal courts refuse to weigh in on the issue. Now, however, with the Obergefell decision, the Supreme Court has opened the floodgate for federal legislation and judicial decisions with respect to family law matters. All of these developments are contrary to the tenets of federalism as envisioned by the Founding Fathers when they originally ratified the United States Constitution. By legislating from the bench, the Supreme Court has set us on a path of lawlessness.
Well, even what's more is the recent ruling here in Tennessee. Where the states do not have the authority to grant divorces now. Now, because and the way I'm understanding it is, if you have a married couple, if one of those individuals in the marriage does not want a divorce to be granted because now the Supreme Court has ruled that marriage is a right, they have the right to be married. Well, the problem with that is, and again, our friend Nelson actually, all three of us actually talked about this on the phone, and we called this months ago. We knew this was going to happen. And he brought it to the forefront, and we kind of ran with it and picked it apart as we do, and analyzed it even more. Essentially, now people do not have the quote-unquote right to get a divorce because it infringes upon the quote-unquote right to be married. So essentially, all divorces technically could be, again, using the logic of the court, all divorces could technically be annulled, which would make every single person who had a divorce before now, if they wanted to be married, not divorced, now they have standing to sue and say, no, I don't want to be divorced. So if their, their partner or whoever it was, their spouse is remarried to somebody else, now you have an issue of polygamy, which is a federal offense.
Well, not polygamy so much as bigamy. Right. And, now looking to the use of the 14th Amendment substantive due process clause to create the right to marry, this in and of itself is a violation of the Ninth Amendment to the Bill of Rights of the United States Constitution. I mean, pursuant to the Ninth Amendment, the enumeration of certain rights shall not be used to disparage or deny other rights retained by the people. Basically, what that means is the federal government, indeed any level of government, can neither create nor destroy our unalienable rights. Therefore, when examining the rights of Kim Davis, it is clear that this is the Supreme Court utilizing the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause in such a way as to disparage her constitutionally protected First Amendment right to both freedom of speech and free expression or exercise of religion.
Yes.
And, what's more, the district court in Kentucky further deprived Mrs. Davis of her rights when holding her in contempt of court for refusing to issue marriage certificates to same-sex couples. By legislating through the bench, the United States Supreme Court has created a constitutional crisis in which one amendment, the 14th, is utilized in such a way to deprive Mrs. Davis of her fundamental liberties. In other words, we have a casebook example of a Ninth Amendment violation on our hands. Jeremy, it has always baffled me as to how so few people understand the scope and application of the Ninth Amendment to the United States Constitution. On the surface, this really reads as one of the easiest amendments to understand. Nonetheless, it has rarely been utilized in the practice of constitutional law, yet it is undeniable that this is one of the amendments that paints the truest picture of the fact that the United States Constitution is based off of a system of natural law. It reiterates the fact that the rights that are contained in the United States Constitution are not created by government. Therefore, government is incapable of taking away rights. That is the entire impetus, point, and purpose of the Ninth Amendment to the United States Constitution.
Yes, and as we've discussed before, these are the truths that are self-evident that Thomas Jefferson spoke of in the Declaration of Independence. These are the very things that these elitists, potentates, and despots not only fear, and when I say fear, they fear that the people have the understanding of what the Constitution is.
Right.
Many people, and I've had discussions, you've had discussions, in fact, you and I both have been engaged in discussions with individuals who have said, well, I've read the Constitution, I read it all the time. Well, you know what? I can pick up a biology book or a chemistry book and I can read it. It doesn't mean that I comprehend it.
Right.
There's a difference between reading and understanding. And this speaks volumes to the fact that these same individuals, and even some individuals that have a very generic and basic understanding of the Constitution, they've made the comment that, well, the Supreme Court has made the ruling, so now it's the law of the land. What they don't understand is that the Supreme Court, any ruling that they make, they have no constitutional authority to enforce that ruling. So with Kim Davis being held in contempt of what? Contempt of a Supreme Court ruling? It doesn't happen. It's impossible because the Supreme Court does not have powers of contempt. The only way they can get anybody to abide by that or bring any contempt charges is to have a lower court issue a ruling of contempt.
Well, in the case of Kim Davis, it was a district court in Kentucky that had issued it, because it was a lawsuit brought by the ACLU to force her to enforce it. Now, the problem is, force her to enact upon that as a law. But except, where is the law written? There is no law which defines same-sex marriage. There is only a Supreme Court ruling. However, as the case of Erie v. Tompkins clearly demonstrates, there is no federal common law. So, in order for there to be this type of notion, and of course it hasn't been done this way in practice in forever, but technically it's supposed to be that the Supreme Court cannot impact the state laws like this. So, until there is a change in the law books, and basically what they had said was that any definition of marriage is between man and a woman violates the 14th Amendment, therefore those laws have to be changed. The problem is they're still on the books. And until they're removed, she would actually be in violation of state law. And if we recall that she was in an elected position, it was the people that elected her there, and if they wanted her to hold a different position than the one that she, embraced, then they would have recalled her or changed her or elected her out at the next election. But we've already seen from the types of gay marriage issues that are coming up that the radical, rabid minority that has pushed for this doesn't want to wait or use the rule of law. They will use the law as a weapon to attack people, such as going after priests who don't want to conduct a gay marriage ceremony, or to fine and penalize bakeries that are privately owned, no government subsidy anywhere in sight, and they're forcing them to provide for these gay wedding couples. Now, I'm sorry, but that is a huge overreach of governmental authority, and that truly is a violation of the baker or whoever it is, freedom of the free exercise of religion as protected by the First Amendment.
True. And, what a lot of people don't understand is, federal law actually prohibits this very thing. Mm-hmm. You have Title 18 U.S. Code, Sections 241 and 242.
Right.
Under 241, in conspiracy against rights, it's a 10-year felony. Mm-hmm. It's an absolute 10-year felony. So, the federal government wants to play ball with this. They want to be the ones that are leading the charge. Mm-hmm. I think it would be proper for federal law to be applied here as a recourse, as an absolute recourse. Go right after the individuals who conspired to violate and infringe her constitutional rights and the constitutional rights of every single voter, not only in her district, but the entire state of Kentucky, because of those individuals voted to amend their constitution to define marriage as between a man and a woman and make it as state law.
And, of course, it is a clear violation, once again, of the 10th Amendment.
Mm-hmm.
And it's amazing that they are trying to say that the states have no authority here. To do that is to completely disregard the proper tenets of federalism as outlined in the United States Constitution. The 10th Amendment states that where a right is not defined, or where the states are not prohibited from acting, then that power or authority automatically reverts back to the states and the people respectively. And of course, the state being the state governments elected by the people, meaning as a representative body. And of course, that ties back into the problem that you had with what a lot of people say with states having rights. Mm-hmm. States' rights merely means the representative bodies of the people being elected, duly elected to the state governing bodies. So what we have here is an overreaching, overzealous federal government attempting to force a radical and revolutionary change onto people. They are wanting to make a certain way of thinking illegal. And that is unprecedented in the history of the United States. We've never had it before where you could be punished for believing a certain thing. Now, you could be punished for acting in a way that infringed upon the rights of others, but to hold a contrary belief from someone else, and when you are a private actor, to be fined or punished or penalized for that, that is wholly separate ground. It's destructive, and it's something that really should not take a foothold here in the United States. We are seeing despotism and tyranny in a new light here that is absolutely shocking and disgusting.
Absolutely, and Thomas Jefferson, I think said it best as far as a remedy goes for this. From time to time, the roots of the tree of liberty must be watered with the bloods of patriots and tyrants alike, for it is its natural manure. And we've seen this before with the American Revolution. You know, in the beginning years, when we declared our independence from the crown, under, you know, the auspice of, you know, we are free individuals. We don't hold servitude to anybody.
Right.
The tyranny that was placed on the colonists and the individuals that, you know, came here seeking religious freedom, exercising the ability to keep and bear arms, not only for protection of their property, but also for protection of themselves. And that was one of the main reasons why the Revolutionary War began, was because the British came in and they said, no, you can't have muskets or you can't have firearms. And they began to take things from them. If people can't defend themselves and they don't have the tools to do it, and when I say tools to do it, I'm referring to the Bill of Rights. That is a tool chest. It's, you know, the mechanics and the developers and the framers of our Constitution. They understood we need to have things in place to preserve our freedoms and our liberties and to perpetuate them for ourselves, but also our future generations or posterity, which is exemplified and specifically mentioned in the preamble of the Constitution. So, you know, without having the ability to do that, we have what? It goes back again to people falling into this whole thing with political correctness, saying, well, you know, I don't think people should have guns because, guns aren't what make people safe and so on and so forth. Those individuals are jumping at the opportunity to take every freedom and liberty that they have, throw them into a basket, and anchor it down with a rope and a rock and toss it into the deepest body of water that they can find in order so that they can feel safe. All these feelings. You know what makes me feel safe? Knowing that I have the God-given right to protect me and mine, as well as other countrymen, fellow citizens of the United States, should the need arise. Do I want that to happen? No, I pray to God I never have to take anybody's life. But knowing that I have the authority, the right to do it, in defense of myself, my family, my friends, other innocent individuals, that's what creates that safety for me.
Right. And what it comes down to is that we have to have a notion of self-responsibility and self-accountability. The United States has always been premised on this notion of a freedom of thought and the ability to act for oneself. We have embraced that because it goes back to this notion that the consent of the governed requires that sovereignty, by its nature, must root and spring forth from the people. If the government is to serve the people, it should be limited in nature. But it has been completely perverted and drawn away from that to where the political actors are now acting under this belief that they are our masters. It is clearly that way because they have created this separate code of conduct for themselves as opposed to what they expect us to follow and do. It shows that they are acting in the same way that a monarch or a king would be. Under the old definition of sovereignty, the king was known as a sovereign. That was the sovereign. Now, in England, it was a little bit different. They had expanded it to be sovereignty rested in the king with the consent of Parliament. But we, in the United States, adopted a wholly separate principle from all of that when we said that sovereignty rests in the hands of we, the people of the United States. That is such a beautiful and marvel concept. But when you look at the way that the political powers that be act today, their behavior clearly indicates that they do not believe in that simple yet revolutionary principle. They are in effect trying to enact a socialist system, and I even think that socialism is a misnomer. If you really want to call socialism by what it truly is, it is a form and facet of neo-feudalism. We are going to go back to serfdom if we embrace this kind of system. And it's why I look at people like Bernie Sanders with sheer amazement. How could a man who is an avowed socialist be accepted by the people as an even possible contender for the office of President of the United States? It's completely frustrating and outrageous.
Sure. Well, that would be like back in the 40s and 50s, people, propping up George Rockwell from the American Socialist Party, who was a friend of Hitler. Right. He had dealings with Hitler. He had a lot of dealings with Margaret Sanger. Right. All these nefarious individuals throughout history that wanted what? Nothing more than to rule supreme over the whole world. That's what we're facing now here in our own country. It is not in other parts of the world as it was in World War I and II with Germany and the Ottoman Empire before that, so on and so forth, and then Russia later on. It's here. It's not at our doorstep. It's kicked down the door. It's in our homes. Right. It is absolutely in our homes. I mean, this garbage that's on TV nowadays. And again, I'm going to mention our mutual friend Nelson, who brought up the term Panama circenses, simply meaning bread and circuses. If people are fat and happy, they don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to disrupt their own lives because it's an inconvenience for them. Right. We're an instant gratification society, and anything that would shake those people to their core is unfathomable in their minds, and they don't want to have anything of it. I'm of the mindset I don't want to rock the boat either. I just want to capsize it and find out who's going to sink or swim. Right. That's what needs to be done. This is what our founding fathers did. This is what Thomas Jefferson did when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. It's what George Mason did when he put pen to paper with Virginia's state constitution and then approached James Madison with the Bill of Rights. Mm-hmm. That's what we need to get back to that. We need to get back to that mindset of we are free individuals. We are the sovereign.
Right. And the fact that we have even departed from that demonstrates that there has been an orchestrated effort to attack the American national identity. And you see this with the balkanization of the way things are being taught. There should be no hyphenation when it comes to American. There shouldn't be African American, Mexican American, purple flying people eater American. You should be an American with your loyalty to the Constitution and those fundamental liberties which were endowed to you by your Creator. And the fact that we have even gotten away from that is frightening. It speaks volumes about the character of these progressives that are progressively attacking the very fundamental foundations of the United States. They hate and despise everything that represents the core principles of what is good and right in the United States. And until we are willing to take a stance against them, we are going to continue to see this country spiral out of control towards mediocrity, and if we're not careful, ultimately perpetual failure.
Well, and this reminds me again of a very simplistic understanding with the Ninth Amendment. Mm-hmm. Taking away our rights, wanting to legislate from the bench, the government creating these so-called rights. Of course, right. they realized this from 1803 with Marbury versus Madison, that hey, we have a foothold, we can do this now. And then again in 1810 with Fletcher v. Peck, where both cases dealt with establishing judicial review. Marbury versus Madison at the federal level, Fletcher v. Peck at the state level. Mm-hmm. So when doing that and going into manipulating the Constitution and construing it to mean one thing as it does another, people don't understand that the Ninth Amendment explicitly prohibits any interpretation of the Constitution. That is what construe means. You cannot take anything that's in the Constitution and interpret it to be applied to something else, whether it's disparaging the rights of anybody else or infringing upon them. You cannot create a standard to where people's rights are violated. And that's what's being done. And it's not just with gay marriage. You look at this whole Moms Demand Action. This blatant and vile attack on our Second Amendment. Guns kill people. You know what? None of my firearms have ever killed a single individual. Not one of them. And they never will. Because they are inanimate objects. They are incapable of actually discharging themselves on their own will, because they don't have free will. We have free will. We make the choice. This goes back to the mens rea and actus reus that you were speaking of before. We have the mental forethought and then the actual action of putting that into motion.
And it ties into this notion that, again, when you look at what the left perpetrates as an argument or contends to be an argument, looking back at the Dylann Roof case, they applied his thoughts, his actions, his derivative thinking to an inanimate object, that being the Confederate battle flag. In the case of Vester Flanagan, they attempted to once again apply it to an inanimate object, guns. Why is it that we cannot get back to the actual fact that it is their deluded thinking, and it is that they are acting in contrary form to the United States Constitution? All of these people, when you look at the roots of it, are not following the proper social contract as envisioned by the Founding Fathers and is beautifully personified and codified through the United States Constitution. All of our problems, or at least a vast majority of them, are deeply rooted in this diversion or distance from the proper scope and application of a constitutional government. It has driven people to this sort of tension, and this balkanization, this notion of identity politics, is nothing but the same kind of poisonous fruit stemming from the idea of political correctness, which is also rooted in social Marxism. Now, why people are falling for this ruse that Marxism is a new thing, or that hopey-changey, as with President Obama, would be different, or that somehow the actors of today could better implement it than before, or that it's new. No, none of this is new. None of it can be applied properly, because Marxism is an inherently flawed system. It does not take into account human nature. It does not take into account natural law. In fact, it is diametrically opposed to natural law. What it comes down to is these guys are trying to exercise control through a failed system that for the past 150 some odd years that it has reared its ugly head since Marx put his pen to paper, since Engels put his pen to paper, has failed. It will always fail, and it will bring and wreak nothing but havoc, misery, tyranny, despotism, and destruction. But for some reason, we in the United States have been hoodwinked by these agitators on the radical extreme left, and they have gotten their claws into the social fabric of the United States of America, and we have got to root them out.
Well, and again, this goes back to resting squarely with the indoctrination and the rearing of the ugly-headed beast, the Leviathan, the cancer known as political correctness. And I'll give our listeners a couple of examples. Illegal immigration.
Yeah.
Now, if people actually understood those two words, immigration is the legal process of which an individual goes to a country to gain citizenship.
Yeah, it's naturalization.
It's naturalization. How can someone illegally do something in a legal fashion?
Well, yeah, it's like, how can you legally lynch someone?
Correct. The other, and it just slipped my mind, and I'm sure it'll come back to me at the most inopportune time.
Isn't that how it always works?
Absolutely, but the point I'm making with this is taking something that means one thing, like the term liberal. Okay, again, I refuse to call leftist, progressives, Marxist, socialists, communists, Leninists, Stalinists, Maoists, any of the ists. I refuse to call them liberals. Why? Because this term liberal is root term liber, meaning rooted in liberty. How could an individual call themselves a liberal if they want to do nothing but to destroy liberty?
Well, it goes to the point that they always play these Orwellian word games. Strength is weakness, weakness is strength. You know, all animals are created equal, but some animals are more equal than others. And of course, we'll get into more of this when we come to the next segment, but we have yet again another little connecting flight to bring up. So, sit back and relax while we get to this next segment. In fact, my first officer here, Jeremy, I think you've got a story about a sniper. So, when we get back off of the little break here, I'll let you take it away. All right, we're back. Jeremy, why don't you take it away with that sniper story you had mentioned?
Okay, I'm trying to bring it up here, and this came across earlier, and when I first heard about this, I'm thinking, not another DC sniper incident. The story I have here is actually from the AZ Central, Arizona Republic.
Right.
Let's see here. Okay. basically what it boils down to is there's a sociopath who, by last count, I believe, has killed 11 people.
Wow.
Well, there's been 11 shootings on the freeway.
Right.
It says here, a bullet pierced the side of a tractor trailer on a Phoenix freeway Thursday, and police said they were treating it as the 11th attack in a string of shootings over the past 2 weeks that have terrorized drivers. So apparently this has been going on for 2 weeks. Why it's just now making national news today is beyond me, because I just first heard of this story today.
Right.
Governor pleaded for the public's help earlier Thursday, and authorities said they could be dealing with more than one gunman. Now, what has our society come to where we allow things like this to happen? It's come to the point to where we have rogue sociopaths, and it wasn't too long ago, earlier this year, the incidents in, I believe it was New York, where there was individuals on the lam, shooting people and so on and so forth. When we allow these things to happen in our country, it sends a very damaging message to the core, to the public. It shakes us at our core. Again, speaking to this feeling of safety, this actually, it takes people's safety to a whole new level.
Yeah.
People they're looking for the federal government to step in and help. They're looking for the state governments to step in and help, and they want to comply. But really, if things like this would have happened back in, 1803, given the limited technology that they have, as opposed to what we have today, it wouldn't play out like this.
No, not at all. The people of the town would rise up against them. Even as far back as the 1960s, when at the University of Texas, back in 1963, Charles Whitman climbed the tower on the university with a high-powered rifle and a scope and started sniping people. What's not really discussed in the story about that anymore is that the police actually turned to deputizing average citizens who came with their own hunting rifles, and in fact it was a citizen of Austin who went up with his own rifle and took out Whitman. Back then, what had always been the accepted norm in the United States was that the people would take responsibility for their security and would help law enforcement. And when you compare that to today, how we've had these rash of police shootings, or these sociopaths that are running around with 2 weeks doing killings and the media doesn't cover it, there's a problem. And again, I point back to that Roanoke, Virginia case with the 2 people being killed on air, the 2 reporters, Mrs. Parker and Mr. Ward, by their former colleague. Why has that all of a sudden disappeared from the media? It's because it doesn't fit this politically correct story that the media magnates have been weaving. Now, of course, yellow journalism is what this used to be called, when you had people like William Randolph Hearst orchestrating the news, fabricating the news for their own purposes, their own agenda. That was known as a negative thing, but now it's simply known as journalism.
Sure. And I have to correct myself here, reading the story, and again, I just found out about this today. According to this article, which I actually switched articles, this is from NBC News now, which I really don't want to use them as a source, but this is what they're reporting. It says, police say drivers have been lucky so far. The only injury was a 13-year-old girl who was cut by flying glass when the window of her car was shattered by a bullet. So apparently there have not been any fatalities. And I certainly don't want to, give people the notion that there have been. If I misspoke, I apologize. But it still doesn't change the fact that you have a sociopath utilizing munitions against innocent civilians and residents of the state of Arizona. See, to me, when something like this happens, it reminds me of Christopher Dorner a couple years ago. The former, I believe he was a former police officer in California, lost his head, and, well, in the end of the result, I believe that may have been what happened, but he went on a killing spree.
Right.
We had other individuals going on killing sprees. And again, the media, the so-called media, they want to latch on to one specific thing, inanimate object, the gun. Thankfully, with this so far, they haven't done that, to my knowledge. I'm going to be digging up for more stories and whatnot, and potentially in our next Voyage, we'll have a recap of this.
Right.
And have a little bit more clarification as this whole thing unfolds. And bottom line is, when there's a situation like this, people want to place everything at the feet of law enforcement, yet at the same time, many of those same individuals are crying out against police brutality, so to speak, because they have no comprehension of what law enforcement officers go through, the training they have, which I've had some of that training myself, the various different things that play into an active shooter situation. It's just, I can't really say that it's complete ignorance, because it's not. It's partial ignorance, but more than anything, it's utter stupidity on behalf of these people.
And it's also a deliberate act on their part. They have an agenda, a vision for the country that they want to see. And I'm going to segue this into a story that is now affecting the once supposed presumptive nominee of the Democrat Party for their nomination for president, or presidential candidate in this upcoming election. It has now been released, according to Breitbart, that O'Malley has put out a film in which an undercover camera was snuck into the Arizona headquarters of Hillary Rodham Clinton's campaign, where they're sitting there laughing about ignoring and knowingly violating Arizona's voter ID law. So here, which, by the way, according to Arizona law and according to this Breitbart article, is actually a felony. So here we have the head of Hillary Clinton's campaign in Arizona committing a felony and laughing about it on tape. If that does not truly expose Hillary as one of those political elites that sits there and laughs at the law, this on top of the private email server scandal and everything else that is surrounding her, I don't know what else will. And of course, the radical left-wing progressives in this country are not going to do anything to tear her down, other than the fact that this may be an orchestrated attempt by the Obama administration to get somebody even further afield to the left in power, maybe like plugs bite me Joe Biden. But what we're seeing here is this all sorts of willingness to operate outside the scope and application of the law and establishing a separate code of conduct for themselves. And the reason I keep harping on this is if you go back to the way that our founding fathers envisioned this country, we are a nation of laws, not of men. In other words, the law should apply to you as it should apply to me, as it should apply to Hillary Clinton, as it should apply to any citizen of the United States. But we've gotten so far away from that.
Well, I think it's safe to say that if either you or myself or any other like-minded individual were to run for public office, I mean, even at the lowest level, and something that scandalous was done on our part, that would be it for our careers. Even if it would be over before it even began. Not only that, we would probably end up in jail or prison.
So,
It's just, you know, again, people who hold power, they're under this guise of, how do I keep that power? They don't want to surrender it. By surrendering it willfully, and when I say willfully, I mean legally, under the terms of the Constitution, under the terms of our laws that are rooted on and based on the Constitution, which is the supreme law of the land.
Right.
They're forfeiting, as my dad would say, their tea times, both, at noon and on the golf course. They're giving up so much that they've come to mold and shape their lives around, that they have themselves lost the simple concept of what the difference between right and wrong is. They're polluted, and eventually, when it's kind of like if you have, a lake or a body of water that is enjoyed by everybody, and when it becomes tainted and polluted, and nothing is done about it, eventually the people around you or around that body of water become polluted themselves and tainted and possibly even dead.
Yeah. And so what it shows is that we in the United States today are facing a crisis the likes of which has not been experienced in this country, I'd say, since arguably the time of the Revolution.
Sure.
But we here on the Wright Flyer will keep you up to date with everything and try to keep you locked into what the proper scope of government is so that we can begin this process and continue the process of building America back up. We've reached the time that it is for us to begin our descent, so I'm going to have the flight attendants go ahead and give a last round of drinks as we prepare to land. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, this is your Captain Randy Wright, and that was my co-pilot and first officer, Jeremy Grapington. We want to wish you happy trails as you head off, and we hope that you choose to fly with us here at our state-of-the-art radio program again in the future. We'll see you shortly.